Our guests are Phil Hose, the author of Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice. This is published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. The book is just out, and with him is none other than Claudette Colvin herself. She's originally from Pine Level, Alabama, which is south of Montgomery, toward Troy. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to start our interview by reminding the listeners that Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith, two teenagers, had shown through their courage that at least some young people were ready to act. These two teenagers, and Claudette was the first one, actually set the stage for the Montgomery bus boycott. Phil, if it hadn't been for you and Frank Sikora and another writer for USA Today, we might never know this story.
Well, that's true. And in my own case, I was writing about young people in U.S. history. And when I got to the Civil Rights Movement, I heard this story that there had been somebody before Rosa Parks, a 15-year-old girl who had taken the same stand, refused to surrender her seat to a white passenger, and had been treated quite roughly, had been handcuffed, jailed, and then was treated roughly by her schoolmates who at times mocked her and weren't willing to accept her courage and her pioneering act. I did more and more research on it and found that this same girl, Claudette Colvin, also put her name on a lawsuit, one of four people, all females, who took on the segregation laws in Montgomery and in Alabama, and won a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, Browder versus Gale, and did for public transportation what Brown versus the Board of Education did for schools. And I was just amazed by this person's courage, and I made up my mind I was going to try everything I could to talk to her and interview.
And it was quite a story how you tracked her down.
Well, she was very good at remaining anonymous. I tried for a couple years to find her and couldn't. She had an unlisted phone number, and I couldn't find out where she lived. And then a reporter for USA Today named Richard Willing did a story about Claudette and Mary Louise Smith, and it was clear that he had interviewed her. So I called Richard Willing and said, "Are you still in touch with Claudette Colvin?" And he said yes. And I said, "Would you relay a message to her that there's an author who would like to write a book with her?" And he said, "Okay, I will." And called her, and he called her for 4 years, maybe twice a year, maybe 3 times a year, something. And always this message kept getting bounced back to me. Claudette Colvin says that maybe she will talk to you after she retires. And I'd all but given up, and one night I came home from something. There was a blinking light on my phone message machine, and it was Richard Willing who said, his voice said, "Claudette says she'll speak to you. Here's her number. Good luck."
Claudette Colvin, take us back to Black History Month. You were a teenager in February of 1955. What happened during that month that so inspired you?
Going back to 1955, my literature teacher, Mrs. Geraldine Nesby, and my history teacher, Mrs. Joseph Lawrence, taught us about the contributions that at that time we were saying colored people had made to America culture. So that was nothing written in the encyclopedias and the history of black people. So it took a whole month. At that time, I don't think it was really legally a whole month. I think it was just a week. But we did the whole month. So the teachers will collect information and bring it to the classroom, and then the students would discuss it. So we discussed the grievances in the city and breaking the barriers. And mostly we talked about Jackie Robinson, and then we began to talk about all the other, Mary Anderson. So we just discussed it while black people wasn't on the TV, and why we couldn't try on clothes in the department stores and different grievances. It was completely segregated, and why we could walk through the park, but we couldn't sit on the park bench. So it was a totally segregated community, and that's what we was discussing.
So 2 teachers actually inspired you.
Yes.
And March rolled around, and what happened?
Okay. I can't recall because that particular day, that evening, that evening, because something must have happened because 13 of us boarded that bus on the corner of Bainbridge and Dexter Avenue. I walked from school. So it was in the middle of the week, and we used to walk from school on a Fridays, but I don't know why we walked that evening. I can't recall. But all I do remember that we all boarded the bus, and we sit as far up as we was allowed to sit.
Which was how far?
Well, okay, going back in my mind. Okay, you enter the back door, and that's the emergency door. One seat above the emergency door. That's as far up. Because we had to go through a predominantly white community. And so there will always be more white pensioners than colored people, or African Americans. So as the bus proceeded on down to Court Square, the bus began filled up with more white pensioners. But before then, the bus motorman asked me to get up. It was four girls. So I remained sitting, and the three other my classmates, they got up when he asked for the seats. So at that particular time, white people couldn't sit opposite you in an opposite row. So he needed the 4 seats. So I remained sitting. So I tell everyone that in the back of my mind, I don't know, but that history had me glued to the seat. I couldn't move. Coming through my mind, what we had discussed in the classroom just surfaced all of a sudden. Talking about Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman. So I tell the people that history had me glued to that seat. No way I was getting up. It was my time to say no to the segregated law.
Were you scared of what was going to happen?
No, because I was a teenager. I was a teenager. So fear, the kind of fear that an adult would feel, a teenager wouldn't feel it. It didn't dawn on me until I was handcuffed, taken off the bus, handcuffed, booked, and when I got into jail and they put me in the cell, and I still, at that time, that key go click, because in those days it was keys, it wasn't remote control, and I knew I was in trouble when when I heard that key go click. I knew I couldn't get out. So I started crying, I started praying, I started saying the 23rd Psalm, the Lord's Prayer, and then I recited Edgar Allan Poe poetry. I tried to do everything to get it. I'm not in this jail, You
were a frightened teenager.
Yes.
What school did you go to?
Booker T. Washington.
You suffered in several ways for what you did. I mean, among your peers.
Sure. Well, at first, at the beginning, they was for me. Then they talked to their parents, and their parents is the one who helped them turn against me.
Let me ask you, Phil, about this story, this teenager who stepped forward and really led the way to the Montgomery bus boycott, ultimately.
Well, what attracted me to the story, really, it was 2 things. First, just the story itself. And the second was the emotional part of it, the courage that it would have taken to be that person. The deck was so stacked against you, the power against you so intimidating. And a bus itself is like a little stage. I can imagine how everybody was whispering and wondering what was going to happen. And then these 2 cops with their boots, I can hear the sound of the boots boarding the bus, and the commands, and Claudette refusing, and then one cop took one wrist and one took the other, and they just jerked her straight up out of her seat with her school books flying all over the place. I just couldn't imagine the courage that it would have taken to take a stand knowing that something like that was going to happen. And and also what it's like to be a 15-year-old girl. I have 2 daughters. One's a teenager, one was recently a teenager. And I know you feel things deeply and acutely, and you're very sensitive at that time in your life. And this was clearly a very sensitive individual going through all that. I just really wanted to talk with her and tell more people her story. It seemed a shame, a terrible shame that she would be swept under history's rug, you know. And I just wanted to grab what was left of Claudette Colvin and pull her out from under that rug, do everything I could, because she deserves a major place in history. The story of Rosa Parks is an incomplete story. Rosa Parks was a good and brave woman, but that story, there was a Rosa Parks had a Rosa Parks. Claudette Colvin didn't have a Rosa Parks. She was on her own. She was the pioneer. There had been others who had refused to surrender their seats to white passengers, but they'd all go downtown and pay the fine and cool off. But Claudette didn't do it. She got a lawyer and she contested the charges, and I was just filled with admiration for her.
And what did Fred Gray say about her?
Well, Fred said that she had more courage than anyone else in the civil rights movement, in his opinion. Yeah. That's her lawyer.
A teenager.
A teenager.
How does it feel to come back to Montgomery? You have lived in the North for a long time. How does it feel to come back to where all this started, where you started it?
I can't find words to describe it. I'm coming back not only I'm not seeking notoriety, but what I'm trying to do is set the record straight so that the young people know that these laws that they now, this freedom that they now enjoy, don't take it for granted. It was won out of blood, sweat, and tears and sacrifice of younger people like they are. So they should take advantage of it and don't what I'm trying to say is I don't want them to regress. I want them to progress and go forward. And I did it for my grandchildren and other people's grandchildren, and I'm so glad. And I'm like the in the Baptist church, I feel like shouting. So much have happened.
And you were the pioneer.
And then no one knows about Browder. No, not only Claudette Colvin, but Browder versus Gale. They don't know that although Mrs. Rosa Parks was the spokeswoman for the Montgomery bus boycott, but her case did not bring a successful into the segregation law. It was the four plaintiffs, Ms. Aurelia Browder, Ms. Susan McDonald, and Mary Louise Smith, and myself.
On page 35 of this landmark book, and the book is again called Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice. We're talking with Phil Hose, the author, and Claudette Colvin herself. But on page 35, it says, the pastor who bailed you out of jail after you were arrested for refusing to give up your seat on the bus for a white woman said, quote, I think you just brought the revolution to Montgomery. And indeed you did. How does it feel to come back all these years later?
Oh, wonderful, and I'm so glad. I thank God that he let me live to see it. And can I interject? This historical thing that happened in Washington, D.C., electing the first African American as president of the United States. And I'm saying I'm so happy. I'm very happy that I witnessed history. And all these people, so many have passed on, and I'm still here. God let me stay alive to tell the story.
It's great to meet you. Thank you so much for both of your visits to us today, and I would like to remind the listeners that at 7 tonight you will be starring at the Rosa Parks Museum downstairs in the auditorium here in the building named for Rosa Parks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Okay. Our guests have been Claudette Colvin herself and Phil Hose, the author of the story of, quote, Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice.